Yeah.
Okay, because I was, oh, here, okay.
Hi, Mimi. There she is.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes. You can also, I think for those of you who have put yourselves, opened your video, you can see each other. We'll probably have a few more people joining us, but I actually am going to start with my introduction now. So thank you for joining us for our talk back this afternoon about 6 Minutes to Midnight, the film that we showed this past week. Actually, it is still screening through this evening if you've not had a chance to watch it yet. Teaching the past and changing the future. This is the work of the Ackerman Center, a distinguished academic center within the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Texas at Dallas. It provides a multidisciplinary view of the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights studies. The Ackerman Center provides an educational, engaging, and transformative experience for a diverse group of students. And by advancing continuous engagement with the past, the Ackerman Center plays a vital part of promoting solutions to the challenges of global justice and peace in our world. As such, the distinguished faculty of the Ackerman Center have long been our go-to experts to help us understand and add context to films about the Holocaust and related events. We are so appreciative of their partnership and friendship with the JCC and our Pegasus Bank Jewish Film Festival of Dallas. So this afternoon, we are delighted to welcome our panel. Dr. David Patterson, Hillel A. Feinberg, Distinguished Chair of Holocaust Studies, the Ackerman Center, University of Texas at Dallas, and Dr. Nils Romer, Stan and Barbara Rabin, Professor in Holocaust Studies at the Ackerman Center and Interim Dean, School of Arts and Humanities, University of Texas at Dallas. They will each share their observations about the film and provide some historical context for 6 Minutes to Midnight. And then we know that many of you have questions, and we will ask that you put them in the chat for us so that we can make sure as many questions as possible are answered. And with that, we are going to start with Dr. Patterson.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's good to have everyone here this afternoon. This is a suspenseful, riveting, well-made film, in my view. But the viewing of the film is richer if we have some sense of the historical context in Great Britain. When the film opens and you see the insignia, the coat of arms of the Augusta Victoria College with the British flag and the Nazi flag, you might think, well, what's going on here? What's that? In Great Britain, how could there be any sympathy for the Nazis? After all, the British basically alone stood between the Third Reich and the rest of the world for about 2 years. The answer to that is that there were actually many sympathizers among British citizens in the 1930s, many sympathizers with the Third Reich. For example, in 1932, the year that Augusta Victoria College was founded, Oswald Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists. The Union of Fascists had 40,000 members by 1934. In 1936, they changed their name to British Union of Fascists and National Socialists. They sent delegates to the Nuremberg rallies. Also in 1934, Lord Rothermere, the owner of the Daily Mail, wrote a piece expressing his great admiration for the black shirts in Nazi Germany. Perhaps you know about famously about King Edward VIII, who abdicated the crown in December 1936 over the scandal with his American girlfriend, wife, Wallis Simpson, and both of them were Nazi sympathizers. In 1943, Alexander Ratcliffe, who was the head of the British Protestant League, an anti-Semitic organization, Nazi sympathizers, in 1943, he published one of the first Holocaust denial documents. Many members of British high society were either sympathized or admired Nazi Germany. You saw Miss Rochelle express her admiration for the Nazis when she was explaining why she gave the Sieg Heil salute. Is there anything wrong with a country wanting to be great? In the 1930s, the Germans sent their daughters for finishing school to the British Isles, and the British sent their daughters to Germany for similar reasons. So sympathy, if not collaboration, certainly sympathy for Nazi Germany was more widely spread than some of us perhaps like to think. A couple of comments about the film. You might wonder, well, what is this? What's the Jewish theme in this film? This is a Jewish film festival. Anywhere you have Nazis, you have a Jewish theme. The hatred of the Jews, anti-Semitism, is foundational to National Socialism. You can't have Nazis without anti-Semitism. There are no Nazis who are not anti-Semitic. It's part of what defines them as Nazis. Notice that that Miss Rochelle seems to be oblivious to this. She seems, to my thinking, much more naive than someone her age in 1939 in Britain. I mean, by 1939, the Nazi program of legislating Jews out of society was well known. Of course, there's the scene in regard to the Jewish theme with Miss Keller, Miss Rochelle's assistant, doing her lecture on Jews and Gentiles. And she begins by saying, how can you tell who is good and who is bad? So more than kind of an ethnic prejudice toward the Jews, the view of the Jews is that they are the source of evil, and that it's in their blood. So there's a kind of almost a moral imperative here that we have to steel ourselves, we have to confront this task before us, right? Note that you may recall the scene when the two girls in the class are whispering to each other about Mr. Miller, the British agent who's the teacher, the new teacher in the school, saying, what would the Fuhrer think of him? The Fuhrer would think he's not much of a man. So this physical prowess is very prominent. When Miller arrives at the school, he's looking at photos of the girls. They're not photos of the girls in class, they're photos of the girls involved in athletic events, physical events. They're like photos from Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda film, Triumph of the Will, which is about the physical superiority, the hale and hearty Aryan. So you have that. The British policeman who is working with the Nazis comments to Mr. Miller when Mr. Miller's been arrested that we must live with greatness. So what does greatness consist of? Greatness consists of power and the elimination of all contamination, starting with the Jews. Finally, when Miss Keller is, rounding up the girls to take them to be shipped out, Miss Roquel asks, "What happened to you? What happened to you?" And she says, "I've grown up." Okay, what does being grown up mean? What does being strong mean? What does being an adult mean? Being mature? It means taking up this task as they're about to go to war, which the SS would refer to as the war against the Jews. So you wonder, if you've grown up to be what exactly? So, and finally, I know I said finally already, but the title, 6 Minutes to Midnight, it's interestingly, on the date when the girls are gathered around listening to Hitler's speech, his speech to the youth of Germany, right? It's August 26th, which is 6 days. It's 6 days to midnight, you might say, 6 days away from war. And indeed, if you've been able to stomach reading Mein Kampf, you know that Hitler makes a point of underlining the importance of capturing the souls of the young, that the cause can't exist without the young. So getting these girls back is not just about freeing the daughters of the Nazi high command, as they're described. It's part of a widespread program of capturing the souls of the German youth. So the high drama of 6 Minutes to Midnight is how imminent the moment when the world will be plunged into night is exactly. That throughout the film, everyone is walking on the edge of night. They're treading the edge of an abyss that is about to open up. And what characterizes the abyss is not just the Nazis' rise to power and greatness. It is, as we know from Miss Keller's Jew-Gentile speech, it's the abyss that's about to open up on the extermination of the Jews of Europe. And as I mentioned, this idea was not something totally alien to much of the British population, including the upper echelons of British society. So those are a few thoughts to start with.
All right. Thank you, David. I think, right, I'm unmuted. Everyone can hear me. Always a pleasure to go right after a learned man like Professor Patterson. Leaves almost nothing to be said. So thank you for all the comments that you made. So I think there are a couple of these themes that were already addressed. The prominence of fascism in England itself. Professor Patterson mentioned it in reference to Mosley. Mosley famously marched as fascist through London's East End in 1936, Cable Street. It comes to clashes there, so this is a highly visible thing. But even beyond the presence of the fascists themselves that are congregating around him, we are also reminded of how intertwined in many ways England and Germany had been. Augusta Victoria was the last empress, German empress and Queen of Prussia. She married William II, but she was also the grandniece of Queen Victoria. So there are lots of long-lasting relationships coming still out of the 19th century that had in many ways intertwined dynastically Germany with England. And that might explain the the kind of oddity at all that we have to first of all wrap our minds around why the Nazis at all would value English education for these girls. I mean, in lots of ways, if you start from the premise of Nazi ideology, then you think there's no reason why they should at all be there. But indeed, this girls' school operates from 1932 until the summer of 1939. And there are indeed some really high-ranking daughters there. So in lots of ways, this kind of part of this refinement of European culture education is in lots of ways still deemed as least as valuable for these girls as it might have been, in the 1920s. And Professor Patterson, rightly emphasized that what they are being educated is almost like the kind of powers of their bodies, the kind of athletic, display of them. But, there's also this very telling scene where they all march in with their books on their heads, right? And have to properly display themselves and their attire of sorts. So they're also in lots of ways trained in very common ideas of refinement and the likes. So in lots of ways, therefore, in many ways, the movie is perplexing insofar as it introduces us to something that otherwise we probably are not so often reminding ourselves of, and that is that in many ways the boundaries between the Nazis, the Germans, and the English during the 1930s are still a little bit more blurred than we might have thought culturally, in terms of legacies and entanglement, but also in terms of how these, respective national communities interact with each other. And I think part of it also, and Professor Patterson already alluded to this, hinges on the fact that in many ways, what happens in Germany is seen by others as a kind of restoration, a kind of return to order, a kind of strength of a fascist leader, not unlike Mussolini in Italy, not unlike what happens in Spain. And in lots of ways, their eyes is more on the kind of politics of power rather than on the kind of racial politics that, are, what we normally focus on. And like David already said, by 39, what the Nazis are about as far as the racial politics are concerned is blatantly obvious. I mean, we are beyond Kristallnacht at this point. So that, I think, makes this movie in certain ways interesting because it kind of brings us back to a time where, yes, we are 6 minutes or 6 days from the abyss, but the abyss is visible or not to all of the participants. It depends on their willingness to see or not to see. And I think that's also what creates a little bit the oddity of that movie. While it works particularly well as a suspenseful thriller, right? It's a great movie of sorts. It kind of leaves you as a viewer a little bit uncertain as to who you should actually, if at all, identify with. You're a little shy of real heroes, of real, figures that you can kind of identify with. David already said that one of the, star powers, of the movie, the one actress that plays the headmistress, plays exceptionally well, and we like her in lots of ways. But she, with an emphasis on her girls, becomes increasingly naive and disconnected from reality. So insofar as she's sweet and caring and all that, we cannot so easily identify with her because she's very naive. That view becomes almost impossible to maintain considering the embrace of Nazi ideology that these girls are exhibiting. Conversely, our spy and British agent, Miller, and teacher is maybe the best, possible candidate that we have, as a quote unquote hero of sorts. But in the end, his charge initially is to figure out when these German girls are supposed to be taken away so that the British can preempt it, which is, in his own mind, he seems to suggest that that's a little bit of a dubious endeavor considering that these are children. So he's not entirely happy with that charge. But more so, he then also fears that if they were not successful in escaping England in time, that then they would be killed. And so he wants to save them. And the kind of happy end is in lots of ways that the girls will remain in England under the auspices of the headmistress, and that's in lots of ways seen as a very positive outcome. But it's a bit of a strange positive outcome, because we're still dealing here with a kind of elite cohort of German girls who were not just simply knitting away in England, but in lots of ways were listening to the Hitler speeches and had wholeheartedly embraced the ideology. So I think, therefore, the movie is in many ways interesting, but I think as a viewer, or at least for me, it was a little bit perplexing. It kind of leaves you at a point where you think, okay, this was suspenseful, this well acted, but it leaves you not like, where you could say, okay, everything has been resolved, everything is overcome, but rather with a place where I think you're equally distanced now almost from everyone in that movie, or at least you've distanced yourself from Miss Rochelle of sorts, and of sorts also from Miller. So I think that's, I think, my sense that I have in terms of watching the movie. It is quite, clear in terms of what this stands for. It draws, really clearly that picture, and Professor Patterson, David, alluded already to that speech, the lecture on Jews and Gentiles, so that there's no mistake here to be made that the girls are just simply innocently unaware of the kind of racial politics. No, they're not. They're very much aware of that. So in my summary, therefore, great suspenseful movie, well acted, but of sort leaves a little bit perplexed at the end. But that's maybe not a bad place to be. I mean, after all, these types of movies, they're not meant to simply kind of leave us always reassured in our assumptions, but maybe they're also at times meant to disturb a little bit our certainties, and meant to kind of steer us into uncertainties, or at least into places where we have to ask ourselves some new questions. And in that respect, I think the movie does its trick. So I think with that, I would like to open up, and I want to just make sure that also thank again Rochelle for inviting Professor Patterson and myself, and also for a kind introduction.
So we do have some questions in the chat. Thank you so much to both of you. That was really wonderful. Joel writes, I thought when viewing this that Mrs. R was a German nationalist versus a Nazi, because she exhibited her distaste for Miss Keller and also her disdain for the girls to be leaving for Germany. Could that be a way to interpret who she was? And is it possible that others might have been that way too?
I can maybe jump into it. I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about these different characters, and thinking also about, again, of the Nazis within the context of them themselves also becoming the Nazis that we have nowadays in our mind slowly in the course of the 30s. There's a very telling that early on, when Hitler gets appointed in 33, that from the wider perspective of the right, from the political right, this is seen as a, coming together of various political forces on the political right, the Hitler Party along with others. So in lots of ways, nationalists wholeheartedly are supportive of it, even though they might not be supportive of the Nazi ideology. And these differences are kind of less clearly articulated at first, but then they kind of clash as we go on. The problem with that idea is, though, that I think it becomes increasingly impossible to be a German nationalist who's supportive of Hitler and not mindful of the fact that between German nationalism, or a certain sense of patriotism, and Nazi ideology is quite a bit of a gap. And that, in lots of ways, by just silently pretending that the one is identical to the other, you are indirectly endorsing and supporting Nazi regime. So that I think that very difference is actually the difference that is evaporating during the 1930s and becomes impossible to uphold. And that's why she appears so naive, as I said. I think that's why, and she's giving these really naive words, my girls, as if this actually has any longer any meaning. So I think it's a valuable way of thinking about it, but it's also valuable then to think how that becomes actually impossible to be just that simple German nationalist in the context the 1930s.
Thank you. Dr. Patterson, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I did, both of us suggested that she's a little too naive to quite be believed, but on the other hand, to cut the movie writers a little slack, they are very isolated in this college. They don't go out on field trips. She talks about protecting them from England. And, but that's still, I mean, the headmistress is a little more naive than one would think. And protecting them is a key here. As the girls are being taken away and some of them decide they're not going to go, Miss Keller pulls a gun on them, right? So are they, who's being rescued from what? Is Miss Keller trying to rescue them from England, return them to the homeland? Or is Miller trying to save them from being turned over to Nazi Germany? Or surely they would continue to be indoctrinated into the National Socialist Project, right? And I just want to mention with the books, I'm glad you pointed out that we see the girls with books on their heads, but never in their hands.
Good point.
And when Mr. Miller comes in, okay, let's open our books. They say, we don't have books here.
Mm-hmm.
And the role of the book is very striking. I mean, Miller himself uses a book to steady his chair, right? And it brought to my mind a little bit a kind of anti-book thinking, going back to book burnings in Germany. Of course, they're burning books that will corrupt the mind. But what doesn't corrupt the mind from the German standpoint are the speeches of the Fuhrer, right? Which they are enraptured by it. Everyone except Gretel.
But David, obviously, I would never disagree with you, but Miss Rochelle wants to protect them from England, not from Nazi Germany. That's
right.
The kind of that's the kind of strangeness of her position, that she's so blissfully unaware of the other threat that is posed, that she just thinks of England as being unwelcoming to them, and therefore
right. That's what she
keeps
said.
them. Yes.
Yeah, I don't want them to feel unwelcome. Yes, exactly. But I think if anyone's trying to save them from Germany, it's Miller.
I think, yes.
But,
I think we have another good follow-up question. Why the order was to kill the girls if if their escape would fail? I mean, that's the assumption that Miller has, right? That Miller thinks if they fail, then Miss Keller will kill all of the girls. Why? I think the idea is that these girls should never fall into the hand of the British and should not the British should not be able to use them as a bargaining chip. So that's, I think, the idea behind that.
Right.
So we have another question from Joel. How important was the microfilm to the story, or was it not so important to the removal of the youth?
Well, it's certainly presented as something of great importance. But the plot didn't rest on the microfilm, right? I mean, the issue of the girls is in play and at the forefront, with or without the microfilm, it seems to me. The significance of the microfilm is to expose how deeply entrenched British Nazi sympathizers are in the British hierarchy and in British authorities with this policeman, right? He's not just a cop.
David, here's an interesting one. Let's see what you think about it. Gretel. I think there's a question here. Gretel was possibly a hero. I thought she might turn out to be Jewish. She was dark, not blonde. She was athletic, but she was bullied, but she showed courage at the end to stand down against Keller. So she's a bit, never quite fully explained character, but what do you think about her? Are we meant to believe that she doesn't quite fit in along the lines of what Susan seems to suggest?
She does, yes. I think, I don't know. Gretel doesn't fit in her thinking or physically, right? I'm pretty sure she's not Jewish. By 1939, she's at this school for girls. But she, in a way, she might be kind of a redeeming character for how we view the German youth, that they're not all brainwashed, that some hope that they can come to look at things differently. But these are kids, right?
But that's maybe just to be critical of the movie one more time. Maybe that's also where we get very little. We see the girls marching up and down with their books on their heads. We see them singing and dancing. We kind of get a little bit more with Gretel and with Keller, but ultimately we don't get a lot of details about what's going on in the minds of those girls, what they're thinking, what they're dreaming, what they're fearing. So there's not a lot of internal depth, I think, actually not to any of the characters, quite honestly. I mean, there's a little bit on the surface when it comes to Miller, a little bit with Rochelle, but we don't know exactly where these characters come from. We don't know exactly where they line up. I mean, Miller seems to have a complicated background by himself with the two sides in terms of his family, but this is not like giving us a great deal of depth in terms of, these girls maybe themselves thinking, reflecting who they are vis-a-vis being in England, vis-a-vis where they came from. Or we don't really have any of that character development, any kind of depth to it whatsoever. They're in that respect quite flat, I find, all the characters.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. It's a sort of an action thriller and not a psychological thriller, right?
yes.
Yeah.
We have here another comment in the chat that maybe I read it that way, that the headmistress's fears were actually not mistaken, because it comes out very clearly when they go on this little outing to visit the castle, and as the girls kind of yell out all kinds of things in German, they're seen right away with a great deal of suspicion by the boys that are nearby, and are very quickly counseled to shush it a little bit. And so therefore there is indeed this deep-seated distrust, and a lot of it has to do, we are like six minutes or 6 days away from war. I mean, we are behind the Munich Agreement, behind the ideas that peace could be maintained. Germany had already invaded now the Czech Republic. I mean, England had already backed and protected its, Poland in case of an attack. So there is now this very deep-seated fear of Germany, and there's the kind of, already this fear of yet another military conflict looming quite clearly in front of everyone. And one sees this in the responses of these boys, I would say.
Well, and it's at this, on August 26th, it's pretty clear that they're going to war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's, again, what creates the whole suspense, right? And I think it's discussed early on in the movie that they want to get it just right. They want to know when the Germans are going to come to get the girls, and then they want to come in, because if they do it too early, then that would be seen as a provocation and could trigger a military conflict. But they have to wait. Otherwise, they could have just come in, right, and just taken the girls at any time. But they want to wait this out.
Yes, and not just one more word. The imminence of war makes the microfilm that with the list of names all the more crucial, of in our midst, and how highly placed are they?
But obviously you're right, but we never actually learn much about the content.
No, we don't.
We're somehow assumed, so it's never quite spelled out, but it's quite clear that this is tremendously important because, you know, there are quite a few men who are out and about, you know, willing to shoot at each other and kill each other, you know, for the sake of coming to terms with all of this.
Mhm.
All right, we have again another one about Gretel. Gretel did reveal that she was frightened, and to my mind, the film producer wanted to show the bravery of this Jewish girl in the end. So I think we both feel that she might have been really brave, and she's very different and very smart and observant, but we don't necessarily think that we are meant to think that she's Jewish. She might just indeed be there, like I think David suggested, just to show that even within the context of these elite girls, there's still a bit of variance in terms of how much they are already, you know, subscribing to the ideals of Hitler Germany or not, but maybe not Jewish. Let me just see, are we missing any other comments here?
There's one comment here from Lisbeth. Distrust of the Germans was inferred in the scene of the girls visiting the castle. As the girls yell out things in German, the expressions of the boys nearby speaks volumes. This scene supports the isolation and protection of the girls from English people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, since there's you and there's me, what do we learn from this movie, or what are we meant to learn from this?
Well, you did mention a certain affinity between the British and the Germans, culturally, historically. World War I notwithstanding.
Mm-hmm.
World War I was a war among cousins,
Mm-hmm.
grandchildren of Queen Victoria.
Right. Yeah.
And I read once that Hitler believed that the British would turn over their Jews, that the British would be much friendlier than they turned out to be.
Well, Hitler had various miscalculations about the British. You know, that's just one of them. The other one that was that also he wholeheartedly believed that they could be easily defeated, which was another one of the big miscalculations. But you know, I think it certainly challenges our kind of assumed senses of this time and the kind of, you know, maybe something about where respectively we otherwise think Britain is, and maybe this is in particular also for the British public, a kind of timely consideration that yes, much of what we otherwise think about Britain in the Second World War is true, but it's also true that even in the 1930s, there was actually greater sympathy still for Germany, for Hitler Germany, and also of sorts for fascism. And that's maybe, you know, the kind of larger lesson of sorts that that one could draw on, that in lots of ways the enemy was both across the channel, but also a little bit on the other side, meaning within one's own society of sorts. We have a return again to the Gretel seems to intrigue everyone. I think we dropped now Rochelle. Nobody's interested in Miller any longer. I think everyone is just interested in Gretel. So Gretel she doesn't fit. That's correct. Her looks and her physical, you know, physically she looks different. She's an outcast, not perfect German type. And maybe that's the other, you know, side to this, without going into this, that it's less often something that we think about. But we have to remember that the Third Reich initiated initially a euthanasia program and was very ruthless in its persecution of those that seemed unfit, even though they were not Jewish, but quote unquote German. And maybe that's, you know, lots of ways that there is, even on the smaller plane here, a certain brutality versus anybody who's slightly different that the girls are exhibiting with it, you know, vis-a-vis Gretel. And maybe that's what this is supposed to bring out. Less something about Gretel, but maybe more so about these girls really not wanting anybody in their midst who's slightly different. I mean, they're themselves quite physically. They bump into her and they push her and do all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
Here's another one. See, Gretel is surging here now in the interest in the why Gretel also wasn't in the room with the other girls. So it seems as if all the other girls share a room and Gretel was not. I think it goes toward the same point, you know, casting her as a bit of an outsider, again, as someone who doesn't quite belong.
Yes.
So,
I think I noticed a question about the bus driver.
yes,
Oh, I missed the bus driver.
yes.
Okay,
Who-
you go, David.
Well, yeah, and I'm sorry, I lost the question. Well,
What is the significance of the bus driver having
Yeah.
observed that scene? I think I missed something that I was supposed to see and hear. Was there more to that scene?
that's dramatically the scene I think is a little problematic. I mean, he's kind of comes out of nowhere and he spots Miller. Is your name Thomas? Yes. Get on. Yeah. I mean, what's the bus driver doing out there? How would he know that Miller is being hunted? He's kind of, it's sort of a deus ex machina, right? Out of nowhere, the bus driver comes to the rescue. So I think I might have missed something too. I didn't see that explained very well. The connection, maybe there was an early scene between Miller and the bus driver that I missed, but you know.
No, but he seems, one is almost surprised how ready he is to endanger himself, right? Because he
Yeah.
then just says, Miller, you run, I'll hold them off, right? So all of a sudden he seems to, I think we are meant to believe that either he's an exceptional bus driver or maybe he's more than a bus driver.
He
Well,
seemed to know who Miller
Yes.
was when Miller was first going to the school.
That's why I think he's a little bit more than a bus
Right.
driver.
so they
somehow
had their,
connected.
yeah. I think that was even as the credits were still running, and at the opening credits, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was very early.
Which is a lesson. Pay attention to every moment, even if the opening credits are still running.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it sets that up, and it also tells us that not all, you know, that there are some of the British citizens who are British patriots and who are not just supportive, but as you say, Dr. Romer, willing to put himself in serious risk.
Mhm.
Knows that these guys could be very brutal toward him, right? And yeah,
So here's, you know, maybe we can return to this one more time. There's a comment by Carolyn. The school represents an elitist aspect. I think that's very clearly the case in terms of the social class, right? This is not like the school just for anybody, but it does still strike you as kind of an oddity of sorts that these high-ranking Nazis would deem this British education valuable. And I think that's, you know, what does that mean in terms of their educational ideals? Well, otherwise they seem to be so intent on fostering a very particular racial and a very particular Germanic education. Why is it that they send their daughters over here? And I think they're still probably subscribing to traditional idea. I mean, one thing that we always, you know, I think to easily think, you know, when it comes to the 30s is that we think everything, the 33 is the big watershed, that everything comes to an end. But it is a watershed and many things change, but there are certain things that also still continue. And I think there's a still ongoing veneration to, you know, inscribed into this of educational ideals that the German elite had subscribed to since the 19th century, of sending their children over to England to educate them there or to France. I mean, those were equally powerful motives. So not everything in that respect just breaks away in 33. Maybe that's another way of thinking about this.
Yes, and even through the 30s, I remember a scene in Kenneth Branagh's conspiracy film, which is about the Versailles Conference, uh, which I think is an excellent film, based very much on the protocols of the conference. But there is a scene in which a couple of the older ministers, German, heads of ministries, say to each other, this is something for the younger generation. I mean, they have, I don't know if you can believe it, but it is believable that some of those who are older and have more respect for, the culture of German literature and philosophy and music, I mean, they may be wondering, even though they're, devoted to the party, as you say, it's complicated,
Maybe just to say one more good thing about the movie, why I think it does something quite interesting. And most often when we watch movies, we are confronted with a slightly bigger time frame, right? We're looking at a couple of years or at least months, but here we are looking at a really very small window. And I think by looking at that very small window of time, these couple of days at best, we get a better sense of maybe understanding how perplexing that time still could have been at this moment, because it's not part of a big story that's already totally unfolding or totally visible. We're not being introduced into that wider story. We're just still dealing with the uncertainties of this very small window, these days before, where everyone fears maybe that the war is near, but doesn't quite yet know, and doesn't quite know exactly how near the war is. And I think that is the part that the movie does really well, that I think sometimes when we look back at the past with our hindsight, then we kind of remove the perplexity and this confusing aspect, because we already relate everything to what comes next because we know, but the people at the time did not. And I think in that respect, the movie does actually quite an interesting and good job and kind of reminding us that, the people at the time didn't have the hindsight, they just had the confusion of a day in front of themselves.
So for the two of you as historians of this time period, it seems to me that there was only one finishing school for daughters of the German elite, of the Nazis. But were there similar kinds of friendship societies, perhaps in New York or elsewhere in the United States, where this kind of exchange of ideas might have been going on?
Well, there was the German-American Bund.
Mm-hmm.
Was led by Fritz Kuhn, and a Nazi sympathizing organization, the American version of the Nazi Party. There were other groups in America at the time. Earl Bauder, the head of the American Communist Party, was a known anti-Semite. William Pelly, head of the Silver Shirts, was infamous. Gerald L.K. Smith, who was the head of the America First Party. And of course, Father Charles Coughlin, famous Catholic radio broadcaster. So the Americans had their share of sympathizers, but I'm not aware of anything like this exchange of students. Although, having said that, there were, American students on exchange going to Germany. Franklin Littell, one. So there were exchange programs, yeah. I'm not really, frankly, well versed in the exchange programs, but I know that there were American political and social movements that were very much sympathetic toward Nazi Germany.
Or in the least, still deemed it, permissible to visit Germany. mean,
Yeah.
after all, there was this Olympics in 1936, and the German Tourism Office continued to advertise the Rhineland and all the other places as places of great beauty and wonders that one should visit. So in lots of ways, there's this very bizarre innocence of sorts that lots of individuals to consider and associate with Germany, that you can go and visit, you can still have your tour of the vineyards and look at the castles and do all these things, not just in the early 30s, but alas, and amongst them are very individual, very famous ones. Sartre is still visiting Germany in the 1930s to enhance his German, where you think, well, gosh, there would have been other places he could have studied German. Why go to Germany, right? Go to Switzerland, right? I mean, they also speak German, right? But it does mean that in lots of ways, this is still, Germany is not quite yet kind of seen as beyond the kind of what is acceptable for many. It's still that one might not endorse everything, but one could still deal with it. One still could trade with them. One could still visit Germany. One could still compete in Olympics with them, regardless of the racial politics. Because in that respect, I mean, Professor Patterson answered already part of that question. Part of the complicating fact of the 1930s is anti-Semitism is obviously pronounced in a very particular menacing way in Germany, but it's not that anti-Semitism is entirely absent in any of the other countries, whether it's England, France, or obviously Eastern Europe, or indeed in the United States. So that in lots of ways, from that perspective, that in and of itself would not have necessarily meant for individuals that there was something, quite unbecoming about Nazi Germany, just because, quote unquote, there were anti-Semites, so were others as well. Now we know obviously that, and they should have known already at the time, that Germany's anti-Semitism was of a very different nature and much more menacing, much more dangerous than any others. But there was a quote unquote shared culture of anti-Semitism that in many ways maybe to some suggest that Germany was slightly less exceptional than it indeed was in the end. What do you think, David?
No, I think that's right. And Germany was not the only country, as you say, where anti-Semitism played a big role in the politics. You got Romania, Poland, Hungary, in the political realm, right? Not just cultural. I'm wondering, I suggested that by August of 1939, it was evident that war would come, but the British political leadership is still perhaps in some state of denial about it, even at that late hour. I mean, maybe we can work something out. Maybe we can continue our diplomacy as we did with Munich and Sudetenland. And keep in mind that Churchill didn't become prime minister until May of 1940, right? So, I mean, the war, when the war is well underway.
No, that's again, I think the point very well taken, that there might have been a very wide fear about the war, but at least also the timing would have remained unclear. And we all know that, however perceptive one might or may not be, we have a way of being also sometimes hopeful that makes us also a little blind to potential threats that, we might have to face. And I'm quite sure that in lots of ways, Britain was also still hopeful that it might be able to stay out of that. And most certainly, they would have not been able to anticipate the type of war that would break out neither. So maybe they were anticipating some kind of military conflict. Maybe they were fearful of it. Maybe many of them were, but there could have been no sense at that time of how the war would have been fought. I don't think anybody would have anticipated that Germany would attack quite in the way in which it did Poland. I think nobody would have expected France to fall as quickly as it did, and so on and so forth. So I think, again, this is not quite yet all mapped out and all visible. To us it is, but that almost stands in our way of understanding that time really well.
Well, keep in mind too, that the First World War, which was horrific, was just 20 years before, right? Everybody lost somebody they knew, everybody in the First World War.
And that's, I'm glad that you're bringing that up, because the reverse is also true, that the Germans were not particularly eager to go to war again. From what we know, there was obviously by this point a fairly large enthusiasm for Hitler, but there's not that much enthusiasm for the outbreak of the war. And when the Wehrmacht or the Third Reich is that quick and decisive in their victories, and the troops are returning, many Germans cheer them on because they think that's it. They are not cheering them on because they're that strongly endorsing the war, but many, are that, excited about the returning troops because they think that's it. So that's maybe even for the German side, their memory of the First World War is still a very, very painful one. And the memory of that loss is still with them as well, which, is something also that normally we think that at this point, they're already all ready and wholeheartedly have subscribed to this idea of war, but that's slow on coming.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, that's right. And as you say, their kids come home relatively unscathed. I mean, they had casualties, but it was a blitzkrieg, right? They won rapidly with minimal casualties, and as you say, maybe we dodged this bullet this time. Yeah.
I think that brings us almost to the hour of sorts, right? I want to thank again everyone for giving us some good challenging questions to make us work a little harder and to talk a little bit more about this. Always appreciate it. And thank you again also, Rochelle, for your invitation. Always a pleasure of thinking about these movies and, but thereby also watching movies that otherwise we probably wouldn't. So thank you again. And thank you also, Adina, for the technical support. Zooming also needs its own, support system. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rochelle, Adina. Thank you, Niels.
So thank you both.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you to our audience. And for those who are wondering, this film has been out in the UK, but it will be released theatrically and on video on demand at the end of March. So we are one of a few film festivals, Jewish film festivals in the US who had the opportunity to present to our audience, early on, and some of the questions that are being asked may end up being answered. I don't think I agree with both of our experts here that there wouldn't have been a Jewish girl allowed to be, nor would her family would have wanted her to be involved in this kind of a program at that time. But I do think that that the individual Gretel represents the outsider and shows just how difficult it would be to in that kind of society to be in any way different. I think that the film was well received in the UK. It has some star power, and I think people were happy with it. And we're just pleased that we were able to bring something new and different, and to have two fabulous experts with us in Dr. Romer and Dr. Patterson from the Ackerman Center to really help us unpack and deal with a complex film. So thank you all for being with us. We have another movie starting tomorrow evening, which we will also unpack with a local expert, Mark Creditor, on Thursday evening. So we hope to see you all for Dews Points, a very different Israeli film, a comedy, very, very different from this one. We're ending on a light note. So thank you all. Thank you again, Dr. Romer and Dr. Patterson, and thank you everyone, and have a great
Thank
Sunday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.